students, Namaste to all. Today we will discuss a novel topic of modern India. It is related with the ideology that had established India and the Indians' liberation force in 19th and 20th century. Let's welcome with the topic. It is Evangelicalism and Free Trade in India, the Charter of 1830 and the Charter of 1833. Let us start from an introductory para. First of all, we have to decipher, we have to discuss what do we mean by evangelical thought. Evangelicalism began its campaign to alter the fundamental nature of Hindustan by opposing Indian barbarism and promoting the continuation of British authority. Charles Grant was the main proponent of this concept, but the missionaries in Sri Rampur, which was located near to Calcutta, served as its ambassador in India. In 1792, he contended that the main issue facing India was the irrational religious beliefs that continued to be the root cause of illiteracy in India. The noble goal of British authority in India was in its ability to effectively change its deteriorated plight through the spread of Christian light. William Wilberforce promoted Grant's ideas in Parliament before to the enactment of the 1813 Charter Act, which permitted Christian missionaries to enter India. The free trade merchants also supported reform and change, arguing that if the company focused on its role as a ruler rather than a trader, India would become a good market for British goods and supply of raw materials at the same time. They asserted that the Indian peasants may reap more benefit from progress under a sound government. In terms of the assimilation and anglicizing policies, there was essentially a little difference between the evangelists and the free trade merchants' perspectives. In fact, the evangelist Charles Grant was the one who oversaw the 1833 Charters Act's adaptation, which eliminated the company's exclusive rights to trade with India. I want to elaborate this statement. I can say that the 16th century ardents of Martin Luther, known as evangelicals, placed a strong emphasis on the justification via faith in Jesus Christ and based their entire theological system on the Bible. Evangelical is still a common term used in the name of many Lutheran churches. Evangelical revival described the religious upsurge that occurred in North America, Great Britain, and continental Europe in the 18th century. These organizations gave less weight to the customs and practices of the conventional churches and more weight to missionary work, faith in the Bible, and conversion practices. They also emphasized the importance of endurance, hard work, and thrift as realistic strategies for advancing God's kingdom on earth. A major component of evangelicalism was the belief that education was necessary for both conversion and salvation, of that the only way to know God by studying the Bible. The Calvin cult was founded by John Shore, Charles Grant, Wilberforce, Macaulay, Henry Thornton, and John Venn after they returned to England. All of these individuals had been involved in the formation of English Company in India. It significantly influenced the beliefs of evangelicals. The Calvin cult demanded that missionaries should be allowed in India and that the slave trade be stopped. David Brown and Thomas Thompson were two of the evangelical missionaries sent to India. The concept of evangelicalism and East India Company. This topic has to be thoroughly discussed. Let's begin. On 31st December 1600, the East India Company was established to carry out the commercial relations with Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, and India was constituted by a royal charter. Initially, it established as a dominant commercial organization. The firm got engaged in politics and served as a representative of British imperialism in India between the early 1700s and the mid 1800s. Europe was relatively socio-economic backward prior to the establishment of the East India Company, despite its fast development. The majority of English clothing before the English Commercial Company was made of wool and was intended for functionality rather than fashion. However, they started to change when low-cost, superbly woven cotton textiles from India with unique colors and designs entered British markets. On the streets of London, a new pattern would come along and take center stage. England was a rural nation with an economy based mostly on agriculture that would have to fight for freedom from the Dutch Golden Age shadow. India was a colony of Britain. By the time the company was dissolved and Britain had emerged as the world's leading political force, Britain was known as the workshop of the world by the virtues of the Industrial Revolution, and the city became the home of the most vibrant financial industry the world had ever seen. There are numerous names for the era that saw the growth and expansion of English East India Company in India. The prominent among them are the early modern period, the mercantile period, and the era of merchant capitalism. Roughly spanning from 1500 to around 1750, it may be said to have started with the religious reformation and concluded with the industrial mass production or industrial revolution. A new age of industrial capitalism, sometimes known as modern capitalism or just modernity, was brought forth by the Industrial Revolution. As the East India Company evolved into a colonial power during the Industrial Revolution, therefore, its economic interests decreased. Throughout history, the English East India Company has been among the greatest influential and resilient establishments. It is noteworthy that the Court of Directors of the company allowed its personnel, apart from politics, to pursue their own business interests, trade undercurrents, decision-making procedures, and structural frameworks. The reason and methods by which the English Commercial Company rose to prominence in the development of trade between Europe and Asia are well understood. Despite the company's domination on English external trade to Asia, the Court of Directors granted its employees the ability to trade in the region, leading to an uncommon scenario where employees functioned as foreign merchants for both the company and themselves. From that point on, England's economy expanded quickly, and throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the balance of trade between Europe and Asia moved in England's favor. Governments are generally designed by the environment in which they are performing. The East India Company was especially vulnerable to the outside forces. It didn't follow a pre-made template, and the 17th century saw the shaping of the corporation form. The English Commercial Company was the first to popularize many of the characteristics that define modern companies. For instance, the business raised and pooled cash by selling shares to the general public, making it the biggest and most established joint stock business of its time. In addition to a president, there was a board of control or board of officers to direct the proceedings. The East India Company held rigorous board meetings that were attended by hundreds of stockholders, in contrast to the rather formal corporate board meetings of today. Additionally, the East India Company did not seem to be a solid, completely formed institution. It started off as a number of cooperative investments that eventually came together to become a reliable company with a steady supply of funding. In reaction to shifting environmental factors, the company's working process, administrative apparatus, and relationship with the British state all changed and evolved throughout time. During the first 50 years of the century, spices were the main focus. As the century went on, textiles gained the importance. Over the course of the 18th century, coffee and tea gained much importance. Thousands more lesser commodities and bulk goods like salt, Chinaware, and indigo filled the lists. Social networks promoted local information sharing and resulted in the addition of extra ports and commodities to the trade system under the English company's decentralized organizational structure. Consequently, the new framework gave workers a great deal of autonomy. These social networks included a diverse range of participants, including private traders and captains. Without openly interfering with the way official business was conducted, and many captains were able to successfully weave their personal economic interests in the company commerce. The company had to offer additional incentives at first because it didn't have much money to compensate its workers for this extremely risk activity. Now we shall talk how evangelical concept fostered free trade in India. Free trade, commonly known as laissez-faire, is a political philosophy in which imports are neither subject to taxes nor the exports are subsidized by the government. Free trade policies for the free flow of products and services across worldwide boundaries with little or no limitation by the administration in form of tariff, quota, grant, or excursions. Economic isolationism and trade protectionism are the antithesis of the idea of free trade. Adam Smith argued that the division of labor across nations promote specialization, increased efficiency, and higher aggregate production. This claim forms the theoretical basis for the free trade theory. Trade restrictions may be justified for the perspective of a single nation, especially if that nation is the primary buyer or seller of a given particular good. In actuality, however, the protection of regional industries might only benefit just a small percentage of the populace and harm the majority. By the beginning of the 17th century, the English East India Company resembled a lower assured sort of Dutch company. However, for the succeeding 2 centuries, everything went the other way around. The English company responded to changing marketplace circumstances by introducing new ports and goods into its commerce, whereas the Dutch seemed to be stuck by their monotonous practices and the ruined costs of their large venture in gaining control over the islands of Indonesia. Spices, textiles, coffee, and tea were the main goods that all East India companies brought in their trade with the East. Over the years, the relative share of these items fluctuated as per the demands of Europe and henceforth the commercial companies took advantage of new profitable opportunities. Upon their arrival in India, the European traders had to gain the favor of indigenous monarchs and rulers, particularly the influential Mughal Empire that ruled over the country at that time. The East India Company was a private corporation, but it had political clout because of its royal charter and well-trained workforce. Indian emperors courted company leaders, extorted money from them, and enlisted the company's strength in local conflicts, occasionally pitting them against Dutch or French commercial companies. The company's business rapidly expanded the scope of its commercial trading activities by taking the imperial patronage. Slowly and steadily, the Portuguese Estado da India, which had commercial bases in Goa, Chatgaon, and Bombay, was overshadowed by the East India Company. Later, Portugal gave Bombay to England as a part of Catherine Braganza's dowry when she married King Charles II of England. In order to assist safeguard the company's ports in China, the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company jointly attacked Portuguese and Spanish ships on the coasts of China. The English Commercial Company also separately attacked the Portuguese in the Persian Gulf residencies, mostly for the political purposes. The company created trading posts in Surat and Madras in 1619 and 1639 respectively. The organization employed 90 people and had 23 factories and towns in India by 1647. The trading company received Bombay from the crown in 1668, and by 1690 it had a foothold in Calcutta. The main factories were transformed into the walled forts of Bombay Castle, Fort St. George in Madras, and Fort William in Bengal. Coastal cities were more vulnerable to foreign influence since the Mughal Empire centered its power in the interior of India. Now, it is quite easy to understand the East India Company's initial goal of acquiring and constructing fortified trading outposts in port towns like Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. Upon the fall of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century, the internal wars displaced many Indian traders to these company-run coastal mini-kingdoms. The Battle of Plassey, which was fought in the year 1757, marked a significant turning point in the East India Company's development from a successful commercial corporation into an established empire. In this engagement, 3,000 company soldiers faced off against 50,000 Indian warriors under the command of Nawab of Bengal. The company's attempt to evade taxes infuriated the Nawab. However, the Nawab was unaware that Robert Clive, the military commander of the English Commercial Company in Bengal, had made a secret agreement with Indian financiers. These prevented the majority of the Indian army from participating in the battlefield. After Clive's triumph, Bengal, which was one of the richest provinces in India at that time, was given extensive taxation powers headed by the East India Company. Clive looted the treasures of the Nawab and sent it back to London, making sure he kept a large portion for himself. It was a radical change in the East India Company's corporate objective, and henceforth the company's previously prosperous trade-focused business strategy became entirely refocused on tax collection. Now, the second part of this lecture, it belongs to the Charter Act of 1813. The East India Company Act of 1813 is another name for the Charter Act of 1813. The British Parliament enacted the Charter Act 1813 which renewed the company's rule to continue in India. The company's charter was firstly extended in 1793 by Charter Act, and then again in the 1833 and 1853 Charter Acts were extended. These acts prolonged the company's dominion over India for an additional 20 years. With the exception of trade with China and the sale of tea and opium, the company's commercial monopoly was terminated by this act, which represented the expansion of British influence in India. It is interesting to study about the act's historical background. The need arose from the Industrial Revolution for all British traders to have access to the Indian market. Industrialists perceived India as a captive source of raw material for British business, as well as a sizable and safe market for selling their mass-produced factory goods. In order to create a captive market for British goods in India, the company rule in that country had to serve as a facilitator to maintain conditions of law and order. More to it, Napoleon Bonaparte also proposed the Milan Decree of 1807 and the Berlin Decree of 1806. This order prohibited the import of British goods into any European nation that was either allied or dependent on France. As a result, Europe had to be governed by the principle of continental system. This system apparently created hurdles to the British capitalists for the promotion of their industrial goods. They sought access to the Asian ports that the British East India Company controlled. In addition, Adam Smith's laissez-faire ideology was gaining momentum. It was a free trade policy with little government intervention in the economic matters. Thus, the merchants were demanding that the British East India Company's monopoly should cease because of the continental system and laissez-faire policy. Consequently, on 21st July 1813, the United Kingdom's Parliament passed the Charter Act of 1813, which was subsequently ratified by the monarch. It ended the British East India Company's monopoly on Indian commercial trade. However, the company was able to maintain and extend its monopoly on tea trading and trade with China for an additional 20 years. 10% of the dividend on India's revenue was distributed to the company's shareholders. The Crown's jurisdiction over the English Commercial Company was established, and the company's constitutional standing was clarified for the first time. The field of education also saw significant transformation as a result of the Charter Act of 1830. It marked a sea change in India's educational system. It established the framework for the Western educational system and the way of life. The Act, which also provided an annual allocation of 1 lakh rupees for the advancement of literary and scientific knowledge, clearly declared the Crown's supremacy over India. It explicitly allowed Christian missionaries to preach their religion and spread the English language throughout India. The Act also increased the authority of Indian provincial governments and courts over European British subjects and provided funding for the advancement of science and an incentive for the resurgence of Indian literature. In his work, Observations on the State of Civilization among the Asiatic Subjects of Great Britain, particularly with respect to morals and on the means of improving it, Charles Grant strongly condemned Indian civilization and culture, viewing it as superstitious and barbarous. He believed that laws alone could not change the nature of people. Grant's answer to India's issue was to free the people from the oppression of the Brahminical clergy. This could be achieved by evangelicalizing India through education. He believed that bringing the barbarians into civilization would also make them materially wealthy, which would then help the British government to achieve its initial objective of boosting trade in India. Evangelicals held a strong dislike for Indian religion and culture. It was felt that anglicizing Indian society or civilizing and improving the half devil and half child Indian would better serve colonial interests in the country. They asserted that Warren Hastings and Lord Cornwallis had no intention of interfering with the religious customs of the Indians, but by exposing Sati's abuses, evangelicals in India forced the British to put forward the theory of evangelicalism in practice. Proponents of evangelicalism, such as Charles Grant and William Wilberforce, held that an immediate assault on the mind might abruptly alter a person's nature. On the opposite side, through education, they aimed to disseminate the true faith of divine, that is Christianity, rescue souls, and banish ignorance and superstition in Indian populace. Charles Grant stated that in order to advance Indian civilization and material wealth, the British should assimilate Indians. He thought that civilizing Indians was our job. To foster and facilitate this process, the evangelists desired that missionaries be permitted admission in India. The British Parliament and the East India Company had forbidden the Bible, prohibited religious instruction, and refused to support missionary work in India prior to 1813. They begged the procedure of religious objectivity on the grounds that they believed Indians might have felt frightened by Christianity and might have jeopardized British commercial endeavors. When the ban was eventually lifted, it was not a win for missionaries and did not lead to authorized endorsement of their work. Rather, they were subject to strict regulations. The act resulted in two significant changes in the relationship between Britain and India, according to literary critic of Gauri Vishwanathan. First, the British took a new role in the education of the Indian populace, and second, the restriction on missionary works were relaxed. The act established a commitment to promote the interests and pleasures and religious and moral improvement of the Indian people, overturning the previous laissez-faire status quo in which the Governor General of Bengal was free to decide how education was provided. According to Vishwanathan, the atmosphere in the English Parliament provided the drive for the additional educational obligations. Concerned about the opulent lifestyle of English commercial company officials and the company's brutal exploitation of natural resources, parliamentarians attempted to address perceived injustice by promoting the welfare and advancement of Indians. They believed that the British should set an example for the rest of the world. Now, during making a justification regarding conclusion, we can say that the justification and legitimacy of British authority in India was achieved through the convergence of several strains of imperial ideology. The resonance of evangelicalism played a significant role in shaping and solidifying the British imperial control in India during this period. A great deal of socio-economic flexibility was granted to trade and missionary activities by the 1813 Charter Act. The evangelical missionaries advocate the legal protection of Christian converts, the abolition of sati, and the killing of female infants. They also requested that the funding of Hindu and Muslim shrines in India should be seized by the British government. Dear students, this was a deliberation related with the consolidation and extension of East India Company in India. I think you have enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. Namaste to all.